Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to the HNRCA Monday Seminar Series. Today, we'll have our invited speaker give a presentation, and there will be time for questions at the end of the talk. We'll use the Q&A box in Zoom, so feel free to submit your questions at any time during the talk. We are thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Krista Varady, who comes to us from the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she is professor of nutrition in the College of Applied Health Sciences. Dr. Varady has extensive experience in meal timing on responses, including body weight, metabolism, and chronic disease. She has received numerous honors and awards for her accomplishments, has multiple R01s and other grants to support an active research program, and is also the author of the book, The Every Other Day Diet. I think there's a lot still unexplored in terms of how we respond to different types of intermittent fasting, and our center and our seminar audience has considerable interest in this area. So we are very excited to hear about your research. So thank you for being with us today. I'm now very pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Krista Varady.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. So before I get into kind of all the nitty-gritties of our data, I just want to go through some basic definitions of what intermittent fasting is. Just because, it's become popular in the past, 5 to 10 years. And I think there's a lot of terms thrown around and it kind of confuses people. So let me just go through some of those definitions. Very basically, intermittent fasting is simply just a period of eating followed by a period of not eating. It's funny because there's about 40 scientists right now on this panel, and we're trying to figure out like definitions of fasting since it's become popular. And this is like the only thing we can agree on. So very basic, but pretty much what we do when we like go to sleep and don't eat for 8 hours or so and then wake up. But scientifically, intermittent fasting is actually an umbrella term for 3 major types of diets that are studied. So the first one is something called alternate day fasting. And this is actually what I started studying originally. I've been studying intermittent fasting for almost 20 years now and kind of started more in the alternate day fasting realm. And then I've moved towards time restricted eating. But alternate day fasting, pretty simple. It involves a fast day alternated with a feast day. On the fast day, people have either just nothing, so you can just water fast the whole day, or you can have about 500 calories or so as kind of like a small meal, so as like a lunch or a dinner. And then on the feast day, that's what we usually just call like a free eating day, where you don't have to count calories or carbohydrates or anything. It's really just like do what you want. There's no monitoring necessary on that day. And then the diet kind of just flip-flops like that. So feast day, fast day, just indefinitely. And then the second type of intermittent fasting that kind of falls under this umbrella is the 5-2 diet. And this one, some of you may have heard of it. It's really popular in the UK. And I kind of see it as being like a spin-off of alternate day fasting because it involves 2 of those fast days and then 5 of those feast days. And that's where it got its name from, 5-2. And then pretty similar to alternate day fasting, on the fast day, people can consume kind of like a small meal as like a lunch or a dinner. And then, they put those 2 fast days usually somewhere in the week, like Monday, Wednesday, just because people like to avoid the weekends for fasting, just because there's more like social occasions, more social eating those days. And then feast days, the same thing, just totally free eating days. And then the third type of intermittent fasting, which is definitely the most popular type in America, at least, is time restricted eating. I'd say it's so popular at this point, it's almost like just synonymous with intermittent fasting. People have almost like forgotten about the other types, I feel. And then our research has really kind of shifted focus more towards time restricted eating recently, just because I think people like it better. And I'll show you the data for that. Adherence is better. People can incorporate it into their lives a little easier. I won't be talking a lot about alternate day fasting, so I just wanted to show you some of our newer data. But alternate day fasting is a little tougher. We have really high dropout rates, like 30 to 40% of people would be dropping out just because, consuming 500 calories every other day is, it's pretty tough. So just to talk a little bit more about what's involved with time-restricted eating. When someone starts time-restricted eating, you have to make two choices, really. One, how long do you want that eating window to be? So time-restricted eating is really just eating within a certain kind of like smaller eating window each day. Research has shown that, typically in America, we eat between like a 12-ish or 11 to like 14-hour window. So basically all time restricted eating is doing is just like shaving off hours of available time to eat. So you get to pick, how long that window is. And I'd say most people do pick around when they start these diets, usually an 8-hour window is the most popular one. There was a really nice observational study published, I think sometime probably like October of last year by Torres et al. And they looked at kind of like how people do time restricted eating. And they followed about 800,000 people over an app and found that most people do pick an 8-hour window, and most people choose to. The second decision is where are you going to place that window? And most people do place it in the afternoon. And that's generally just because, people don't want to skip dinner with their families. Anytime we've designed a meal intervention where we have people like stop eating by 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. or just have like a lunch in the middle of the day, we get really high dropout rates just because, it's not very feasible to ask someone to skip dinner with their family for a year or something like that. And then the other thing I want to mention with time restricted eating, and maybe one of the reasons it's become so popular, is because it does not involve any kind of like calorie counting, carbohydrate monitoring, anything like that. You literally just have to watch the clock. You pick your time. So let's say 8 hours, 12 to 8. You don't eat anything till 12. You eat from 12 all the way to 8. And then after 8, you just start your 16-hour fasting window, which involves, for our studies, we do standardize it. So we ask people to just have water or energy-free drinks like black coffee or black tea or herbal teas, that type of thing. But basically, we emphasize water. And then back in 2016, so I guess around like 7 years ago or so, my then PhD student and I, Kelsey Gable, we started to notice that there was like tons and tons of books on time restricted eating coming out on Amazon. Like multiple books a month were coming out called like the 4-hour diet and the 8-hour diet. And, I'd been studying alternate day fasting till that point. And I thought, well, what is this? There's like some new, like I kind of knew about time restricted eating a bit, but I didn't realize like how popular it was getting until I like looked on Amazon, saw all these books, and I was like, oh, wow, well, I wonder what, maybe I'm missing something on PubMed. Maybe there's been a ton of research. And then, we went to PubMed and found, of course, like 0 studies. So just 7 years ago, there was 0 human trials in time restricted eating. And now I'd say there's probably like a new small like clinical trial being released or published like every week. So just to show you how popular it's gotten. So back then in 2016, we said, well, let's see if it actually works for weight loss. There seems to be a lot of like personal accounts in these books about people really liking these diets. So let's see if we actually test this out in a controlled trial. Does it actually work? So we didn't honestly know what to do. We didn't know like what window we should pick because we did see all these different books with different length diets, but we decided to go for an 8-hour window. It seemed to be the most popular even then. And then we just compared this 8-hour group to a control group that was just a usual diet group. And we asked them to basically not change their food intake or exercise habits. And then it was a 3-month study, so about 12 weeks long. And then we weren't sure with that 8-hour window where to place it. We had learned, from our alternate day fasting studies, we don't want to stop it really early in the day because we'll get a high amount of dropouts. But we thought, why don't we do like 10 to 6? Because maybe people could have like a late breakfast, a lunch, and then like an early dinner. But we realized we got a lot of complaints actually with this eating window. And we found that like people were saying that they were like driving home and they were like slowly watching their window close for their like time to eat with their families. So 6 is like a little too early to cut it. So we usually do like 12 to 8 now for any of our 8-hour studies. And then the primary outcome for this was just body weight. And to show you what we saw, first of all, with adherence, right off the bat, I was really impressed with how much people liked the diet. We had very low dropout rates. In all of our TRE studies, it's like 10, 15%. And again, with our alternate day fasting, it was more like 30 to 40%. So that right away, I was pretty impressed by. And we found that people were able to adhere to that 8-hour eating window on about 6 out of 7 days per week. So this is, it's a shorter trial, it's 3 months long, but still that's pretty impressive. And then the days that they couldn't adhere or didn't choose to adhere was usually like a Saturday. And then they would report in their food records or adherence logs that, there was a party or something that day. So they, just ended up eating late into the night. But in general, yeah, 6 out of 7 days per week. And then in terms of weight loss, they lost about 2.6% of body weight over 3 months. So that's about, for this group, it was about 7 or 8 pounds over 3 months. And this I was kind of shocked by, honestly. This diet, it seemed to it was just becoming so popular. So I assume maybe people were losing like tons of weight with this diet. So I was a little shocked that the weight came off like pretty slow with this. And, we've repeated this finding, and multiple other labs have as well. And I guess the reason I was shocked was because with alternate day fasting after 3 months, people tend to lose more like 5% body weight. So I'd say, yeah, generally the other forms of fasting, like both 5-2 and ADF, alternate day fasting, result in probably about twice the amount of weight loss. But the thing is that people don't, people quit those diets. So sure, they lose weight quickly, but then, they just stop following them. Whereas with TRE, it comes off slower, but I think people like it better. They find it easier to incorporate into their lifestyles. So then they end up like sticking to it longer. So yeah, not a ton of weight loss, but yeah, 7 or 8 pounds over 12 weeks, so 3 months. And then I think by far the most interesting thing we found from this initial study was basically the effects on energy intake. So we found that when these individuals were eating in about 11-hour window at first, looking at their baseline records, and then they basically just cut out 3 hours down to 8 hours. And by doing that, they just kind of naturally cut out about 350 calories per day. And they did this completely without calorie counting, which to me was like such an amazing benefit, because I actually started studying alternate day fasting years ago during my postdoc, because I just noticed how much people got burnt out of calorie restriction because of, they just have to constantly monitor, calories, carbs, whatever it is, in like a paper food record back then, or now, it's like MyFitnessPal and apps and that type of thing. And, people just they can do it for a month or two, but after that, people just stop monitoring things. So with this, you don't need to monitor anything at all. Just by watching the clock, you cut out around 350 calories per day. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And then in terms of metabolic disease risk factors, with this initial study, we didn't see that much change actually. So we did see a slight decrease in systolic blood pressure, but no changes in plasma lipids, fasting glucose, insulin. HOMA-IR is a measure of insulin resistance. So none of that changed. But I think this could have happened for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at baseline, they're pretty healthy at baseline. These numbers are in a pretty normal range. And when someone's already healthy, it's hard to get those numbers to move. And then the other thing is they only lost about, 2.6% of their body weight. Usually you need like 5 to 10-ish% weight loss to see some of these things change. So we thought maybe that was the reason why we didn't see many metabolic effects. But in general, after this kind of initial 8-hour study, we did realize people liked the diet a lot, which was a win for us. We thought that was great. 90% of the people in this study said they would continue with it. We didn't measure that, unfortunately, but just the kind of exit questionnaire gave us that indication. They lost again 7 or 8 pounds in 3 months, and they just naturally reduced energy intake without calorie counting. And just to kind of answer some of the questions I get during the question period is, well, why is time-restricted eating so popular now? It seems to have like come out of nowhere and everyone's talking about it or doing this type of dieting now. And I'd say for me, I really think it's kind of what I already said. There's not a lot of monitoring necessary. I think with just all the nutrition trends and diet trends, like in the 80s and 90s, it was all about like low fat. And then, the early 2000s, it was like low carb and active Atkins and that kind of thing. And with all of those diets, you have to count stuff. You either have to make sure you're not consuming a lot of fat or a lot of carbs, or you're monitoring energy, but all of them require like a lot of monitoring. And I think people are just sick of it. I think people just want like something simple. And really, if you can just like literally just start eating at 12 and stop eating by 8, and that's like the only thing you really have to pay attention to, then, I think it's great. And then some other reasons, it's definitely a very simple diet. It's free, so it's very accessible. You don't have to buy, like protein powders or whatever kind of snack bars or something that conform to a certain macronutrient profile. You can also combine it with other diets. So we have run studies where we've combined it with a low carb diet to like boost weight loss if people are wanting to do that. But in general, yeah, it's just pretty easy and it's completely free. So after we ran our initial kind of 8-hour study, I was a little confused. I still didn't really understand why the diets were so popular, again, because the weight seemed to come off so slowly. So I kind of thought that we might have like missed the mark. I thought maybe people aren't doing the 8-hour window. Maybe they're doing more like a 4-hour window or a 6-hour window, like something much shorter. And maybe, if you cut out more hours of eating, then you're going to cut out more calorie intake. And I kind of got this idea too from Silicon Valley, actually. Like at the time, this was probably like 2018, I guess, 2017. There was a lot of people, like software engineers in California, following like different types of intermittent fasting protocols. One was called 1 meal a day, or the OMAD diet, or the warrior diet. And these diets usually require people to eat in a 4-hour window. So, and, they were contacting me and saying like, oh, you should really test this out. Like we all use it here for like, not just weight control, but it helps us like concentrate. And so anyway, I thought, yeah, well, maybe this is what people are actually doing, eating in these much smaller windows of time, which kind of like boosts weight loss even further. So we designed the second study, again, pretty simple, just parallel arm trial. This one was a bit shorter, so it was 2 months long, 8 weeks. It had 3 different groups. It had a 4-hour time-restricted eating group, a 6-hour TRE, time-restricted eating group, and then just a usual diet control group. And they were eating in, I think for this one, it was like a 10.5-hour window at baseline. And then at this point, we knew that we had to kind of encapsulate that dinner time meal to boost adherence. So for the 4-hour window, we had them eat between 3 to 7 p.m. and then fast after that. And then the 6-hour window, 1 to 7 p.m. So they could kind of squeeze in, maybe a lunch and a dinner. And then our main outcome for this, again, was body weight. And interestingly, I thought with these really short windows that we'd have like lower adherence, but interestingly, we didn't. We had the same number of days adherence. So 6 out of 7 days per week, people were able to stick to these windows. But again, this is a short study. It's only 2 months long. So I think still to this day, we're one of the only groups that have tested out these really. So I don't know if adherence would stay this high, if the study were 6 months long or 12 months long. But, and then we also didn't see any difference in adherence between the 6-hour and 4-hour group. In terms of weight loss, again, no differences between those 2 meal timing groups. They lost about 3.2% of weight over 2 months. So for this group, that was about, I think it was about 9 to 10 pounds or so over 2 months. So definitely faster weight loss, because if you remember with the 8-hour one, it was about 7 or 8 pounds over 3 months. So yeah, rate of weight loss was definitely faster. But then looking at the weight loss data, it made us think that maybe the 4-hour group was really eating like within a 6-hour window. I know I'm talking to a lot of nutrition researchers here, and as you all know, when you tell people to do something, you never, in free living studies, you never really know what they're doing. Like most of the data we get is all like self-reported adherence or food records. So who knows, but maybe they were actually eating in a slightly bigger window, the 4-hour group, who knows. In terms of energy intake, we saw even greater reductions in energy intake with these smaller windows, which makes sense. There's less hours to eat. So for the 4-hour group, it was about a 550 calorie, or sorry, it was a 500 calorie deficit. And then oddly, for the larger window, it was slightly bigger, not significantly bigger, but it was about 550 calories. So overall, shortening these windows, to 4 to 6 hours, you're cutting out about 500 calories per day, which is that actually really interested me because that's kind of what you're targeting when you do a typical calorie restriction diet. With daily calorie restriction, obviously it can vary, but usually we shoot for like a 25% reduction per day, which is like 500 calories. So I thought it was cool that these people could, get that level of calorie reduction without monitoring at all. And then for this study, we did see some changes in glycemic control. So there was no differences again between the groups, but we did see about a 15% reduction in insulin, fasting insulin, and then about a 20% decrease in insulin resistance measured by HOMA-IR, and no changes in fasting glucose. For this one, no changes in blood pressure or plasma lipids in any group versus the control group. We actually very rarely see changes in lipids, and I'm almost wondering at this point if it's just because people are where we're usually looking at people with obesity. The mean BMI in our studies is usually around 35. So maybe there's a pretty good chance that a lot of these people are on, and they're usually around like between 45 to average age between 45 to 55. So I'm assuming a lot of them are probably taking, lipid lowering medications like statins or any of the kind of like blood pressure lowering medications, which, obviously we've recorded, but now we're doing more of an in-depth analysis to see, do people that are not on the medications actually see a benefit? Because we very rarely see any of these kind of more cardiovascular disease risk parameters change with our studies. It's mainly more of the kind of diabetes related stuff like insulin and insulin resistance. And then just a comment on diet quality. So when we were publishing this study, one of the when it was under review, I should say, one of the reviewers was really concerned about diet quality with these really short windows, which makes sense. And I think their comment was really, if you only have 4 hours to eat in the day, so in other words, if you've been fasting for 20 hours, what are you going to eat when your window opens up? Are you just going to like immediately go to McDonald's because you're so hungry and you just want something that's really like high energy, high fat, or what are you going to do? So we did kind of an in-depth analysis of our food records to see if kind of major indicators of diet quality changed. And we found that intakes of sugar, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and fiber, so those diet quality indicators, none of those changed over the course of the trial when compared to controls. So not saying that, I don't think time-restricted eating or any of these intermittent fasting regimens make diet quality better, but they don't seem to make it worse. I find, having run, so many of these trials and looked at so many food records and so much data, it's just really hard to get people to change what they're eating. Even when we provide people in certain other studies with like really intense dietary counseling, like one-on-one, it's really hard to get people to change like what their actual foods are, because it's whatever their family's eating as well. So yeah, in general, that doesn't change with time-restricted eating. And then we also looked at adverse events with the study. And we found, there was no serious adverse events, but we do have, the main thing that's usually reported is headaches in the first week or two. And we find that that's because people are just like not drinking enough water during the fasting period. So once people up their water intake, the headaches tend to go away. But we do get a little bit of dizziness reported, GI issues like diarrhea, sometimes constipation, and a bit of nausea too from people feeling that the fast is making them a little bit nauseous. We've had that reported just because maybe their bodies are expecting food or something and it's not coming in. They're just adjusting their circadian rhythm. So maybe that's why, but most of the time the issues tend to arise in the first week or two, and then we don't see them for the rest of the study. So there is an adjustment period with these diets. We definitely saw it with alternate day fasting, but time restricted eating as well. It just takes a while for your body to, just shift everything to when it's getting food now compared to when it used to, I guess, before the study started. So with this kind of shorter window study, we found, again, pretty high adherence, but it was a short study. So who knows if that would continue. About 3% weight loss. So again, 9 to 10 pounds over 2 months. a natural energy restriction of about 550 or 500 calories per day, roughly. And then we did see benefits for insulin resistance was reduced. And then the last study I wanted to show you, we just finished this up in the fall. And our question here was, is time restricted eating, just the way people do it, so usually like an 8-hour window, 12 to 8, is it better than just daily calorie restriction? And our kind of rationale here was that, calorie restriction definitely works. I know there's a lot of calorie restriction researchers probably on the panel right now or in the audience, but so we know it works. But again, people, adherence does drop off after a few months. So we thought with time restricted eating, since it seems to be easy for people to incorporate into their lifestyles and they seem to like it, maybe they would stick to it for longer, so the weight would come off, slower, but just more consistently. And so we wanted to look at adherence and body weight changes over a year with these two different diets. So we basically had 3 groups in this study, a time restricted eating group, a CR group, calorie restriction, and then just a usual diet control group. And the controls were eating in about over a 10-hour window. So we made sure of that at baseline. And then, or that's what we did for our screening. And then the study was broken into a 6-month weight loss period, followed by a 6-month weight maintenance period. And because we also wanted to see, well, can you use time restricted eating for weight maintenance? Like once you've reached your weight loss goal, can people like still eat within a kind of a shortened window of time for weight control? And so for the weight loss period, we did that 12 to 8-hour window that I was mentioning before. And then maintenance, again, since this is basically the first maintenance study for TRE, we thought, well, I guess we can open it up to like a 10-hour window. We weren't actually sure. So we basically just added on an extra 2 hours in the morning, so 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. For the calorie restriction group, we reduced their calorie intake. We measured everyone's calorie intake or needs, and then we subtracted off 25%. So that was roughly around 1,500 calories for most individuals or on average. And then for the maintenance period, the CR group just ate energy for maintenance. We recalculated that monthly just because, that changes depending on your body weight. And yeah, and then basically we just measured body weight, adherence, and metabolic disease risk factors every 6 months. And this is what we saw over this 12-month trial. We had 90 people that were randomized to these 3 different groups, so about 30 people in each of the groups. And we saw very low dropout rates again. So over the course of a year, out of the 30 people in the TRE group, only 4 withdrew, which really surprised me again, because with we had a 12-month ADF study, and I think it was like 12 people out of 30. It was just like this enormous dropout. So to the point where it was an NIH grant. And I remember my program officer was like, that's a lot of dropouts. Are you sure? Like, what's going on? So people were definitely pretty concerned. But with this, yeah, similar amounts of dropouts, about 4 to 5 people in each group. And interestingly, no one dropped out of the TRE group because of issues with the diet. So, with ADF, we had a lot of people complain about it, but not this one. And here's the baseline characteristics. So on average, they were kind of middle-aged, primarily women with obesity. BMI was about 37 in this study, primarily Black women and Latinas, people that were, I'd say, kind of borderline hypercholesterolemic. It's kind of in the borderline range. Yeah, blood pressure kind of borderline as well, but they were not diabetic. They had basically an A1C of about 5.5 when they started the study. And as for adherence in comparing these 2 diets, we found, again, for this time we had TRE for a whole year, and they were still reporting adhering to it, 6 out of 7 days per week. So it did drop down from, I forget, like 6.3 days per week to like 5.9 or something by the end, but they were at least self-reporting that they were doing it. And it seemed like they were doing it probably just based on their body weight curves too, which I'll show you in a second. And then in terms of CR adherence, we measured that as the % of days they were actually doing their calorie goals by monitoring it in apps. And we found that for the CR subjects that on average, they were adherent 61% of days over the trial. So it's one of the things that was difficult in this was to kind of match how we measured adherence. We weren't sure, again, it was just tricky because we weren't able to really do an exact match on this. But I'm not sure. We're going to have to, that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out. How do you kind of measure adherence similarly in these two diets that require pretty different things? And then this is what we saw for weight loss. So is fasting better or is TRE better than CR? The answer, which many of you probably already knew this, is no. They basically result in the same amount of weight loss. So over 6 months, both groups lost about 5% of weight compared to controls. And then during this 6-month weight maintenance period at the end, where we opened up the window for TRE, which is the orange line, and then CR, which is the blue line, that just ate energy for maintenance, they were able to maintain it pretty well. The problem is though, this is a pretty short maintenance period. It'll be interesting to see like what happens if we like carry this on or do a follow-up, 2 or 3 years after. Are they still doing the diets? Have they been able to maintain it? Because that tends to be the trickiest thing for most people. And then in terms of energy intake, we found that in this TRE study that had no calorie monitoring versus CR, which was basically daily monitoring, both of them reduced energy intake the same. So both by about 400 calories during the study. So very interesting. Again, zero monitoring, and you get pretty much the same reduction in calories that you would with, putting something in a MyFitnessPal every day. Blood pressure, we measured that and did not see any significant differences between the intervention groups and the control group. For plasma lipids, no differences. Again, LDL, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides versus controls. And then glycemic control, no changes in glucose or fasting insulin. But we did actually see an increase in insulin sensitivity in the TRE group versus controls only. So not versus CR, but so there was a slight increase there. And we measured this using the quickie method, which is basically just a calculation based off of fasting insulin and glucose. So we didn't use like OGTTs or clamps or anything fancier, just to clarify that. And then in terms of adverse events, we had no serious adverse events reported. And then occurrences of adverse events were pretty similar in the TRE group, CR, and controls over the 12 months. So again, we did see headaches kind of peak in the first couple of weeks, definitely in the TRE group, and then those tended to go away for the rest of the trial. So general findings from this year-long study, they do result in similar weight loss, TRE and CR. So I think I get a lot of questions about like, oh, is intermittent fasting the best diet, or is it the one that everyone should be following? But my response is always the same. Like, people just need to find something that works for them. I don't think any of these diets are better than others. If like carb counting, if Atkins works for you, go ahead, do that. If you like recording stuff in MyFitnessPal every day, like, please, like, do whatever works for you. But if it's, if you want something more simple, then maybe time restricted eating would be the best. But whatever it is, just make sure you can just do it long term is kind of the most important thing. And then we also found that kind of a 10-hour window was effective for weight maintenance, and that TRE without any calorie counting resulted in about a 400 calorie deficit per day. And then we also saw kind of slight improvements in insulin sensitivity with just the time restricted eating diet. And then in terms of body composition, I just wanted to kind of summarize all of our findings together. So we get, I think probably about 5 or 10 years ago, there was a lot of people saying that intermittent fasting helped maintain lean mass, even, during weight loss, which I thought was a little surprising because, I think it was some other groups were saying that, but I thought that was a little odd because when we looked at our body composition data, we basically found that, with calorie restriction, when somebody loses weight, roughly 25% of that weight loss is lean mass, so muscle mass, and usually about 75% is fat mass. And it's the same with time restricted eating and alternate day fasting, actually. So we're not seeing any differences in body composition changes compared to, just any other diet that doesn't require like changes in protein intake. The only way to kind of shift this ratio is adding resistance training to the regimen, or upping like protein intake tends to help too. You usually need about 25-30% of your energy as protein to kind of help maintain lean mass, and then of course combine that with exercise. So before I finish up, I did want to talk about some practical considerations of how to, if you want to try these diets yourself, or, advise someone else to do them. A couple important things. Again, there is that 10-day adjustment period, or for those of you wanting to run studies, if you do get dropouts because of the diet, it's usually in the first week. So if you can kind of get people past that like hump to stay in, they tend to stay after that. So that's when all the kind of like headaches and smaller issues appear at first. It is possible to exercise during these diets. There's been several studies at this point combining it with different types of exercise. And, a lot of them allow people to choose when they want to exercise, like during the fasting period or the eating period. Whether or not one is better, I'm still not sure, but people don't feel lethargic, basically. It's my main point. Like you're going to want to exercise. You don't feel like terrible throughout the duration of time restricted eating. So you do have energy to exercise. Headaches are the number one complaint we get, but those tend to go away, as I mentioned before, after about a week with water intake. We do permit alcohol intake in moderation. So we just follow the nutrition guidelines of 1 drink per day for women, 2 drinks per day for men. And, alcohol has to be consumed during the eating window, so not during the 16-hour fasting window. And just some questions I get about who should not be doing these diets. Definitely not children 12 and under. I don't think it's appropriate for them. However, there is some emerging evidence in teenagers now, so 13 to 18 years old, showing that time-restricted eating may actually help teenagers with severe obesity lose weight and actually reverse diabetes. So Elena Vidmar's group at USC is doing a lot of these really great studies. And then there's another group in Australia led by Louise Bauer. She's a pediatrician that studies obesity. And they're showing that it is effective, but the issue with teenagers is that tends to be when people develop eating disorders. So a lot of these studies have actually been shut down because of parents being worried about eating disorders, or just groups being worried about that. So it seems, in teenagers, it might be fine if they have severe obesity, but yeah, there's the eating disorder thing, I think, needs to be explored a bit more before there's widespread use of them in that group. Adults over the age of 75, there's a few studies of intermittent fasting in older individuals, but very few studies have looked at just older individuals. So we still need to, I think, kind of tease that apart a bit more, just particularly with sarcopenia and lean mass, changes in lean mass with these diets. Because obviously we don't want older people losing even more lean mass, because they tend to lose it, past the age of 65 anyway. Pregnant women, lactating women, no studies yet, so probably not safe in those women. And then people with eating disorders, I do have to mention, we pretty much always exclude people with binge eating disorder, night eating disorders, any type of anorexia, bulimia. I just don't think it's really good for that group. And in our initial studies of alternate day fasting, we actually didn't exclude people with binge eating, and we found that, yeah, they didn't do well on these diets. So since then, we've definitely excluded them. But another point, and just one thing I do want to mention with that, we do get a lot of questions about fasting potentially, causing eating disorders. That's one of the major safety concerns. And we do give people questionnaires. The MAEDS is a really typical questionnaire for this. And we don't find that people that did not have a history of eating disorders, we don't find that those people actually develop a propensity to, for any of the kind of, basically any of the markers of eating disorders. So it should be safe in that respect. Another major question I get is, does the eating window need to stay the same each day? So if you're doing 12 to 8, do you have to do 12 to 8 every single day? And I'd say, it's yes and no. I wouldn't swing the window like really extremely from like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. one day to like, 12 to 8 the next day. Like you got to give your body time to adapt, the circadian rhythm. I think usually takes for most people like 5 to 10 days to fully get in the swing of like when it's expecting food to come in. So you can shift it around by like an hour or so. So like 1 to 9 p.m. opposed to 12 to 8, but I really wouldn't shift it around more extreme than that. And then another really key question that we have in the field today is like, where should that window be placed? And there has been in the past year, well, there's so many studies out now, there's actually, and I think about 5 or 6 studies that have directly compared early versus late time restricted eating. So, which has been wonderful because now we can actually like answer these questions with some more data. But what we're noticing is that, well, one thing we knew even before all this is that people are a lot more insulin sensitive in the morning. So our ability to like deal with nutrients and just put away glucose is really good right when we wake up. And then it kind of just gets worse throughout the day. So if you're doing like an early eating window, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., that's technically better for glycemic control. Like will probably help, reduce insulin resistance a little bit more, but there's generally pretty bad adherence to that one. Just again, because not many people are going to stop eating by 4 p.m. every day. In our studies where we required people to basically stop eating early, I just remember people saying like some of our subjects were saying that they were the ones like making dinner for their families. So they'd spend all this time cooking and then they'd have to like just sit there and watch their family eat while they were like drinking tea or something. So it just doesn't seem feasible long term. The late window, most likely, the one that most people do, probably not the best for your glycemic control, but you do have better adherence, just it's easier for people to do that one. But going back to the data, it's when all these studies comparing the two came out, I thought we'd see definitely, like way better for glycemic control in the early morning or the earlier windows, but we're not seeing that. About half of the studies are showing that, and the other half are showing that both the late window and the early window both improve glycemic control. So I think the jury's still out on whether or not early eating is actually metabolically more beneficial. And then for anyone that wants to do any further reading, we did publish last year kind of like a clinical guideline paper on intermittent fasting about how to how to incorporate it into people's lifestyles. We have some information for people with type 2 diabetes, for glucose monitoring and medication management. So more of kind of like the practical questions that you may have can be answered in that paper. And then, yeah, just to thank all of my students and collaborators. My PhDs and postdocs ran most of these trials, so they've been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. And funding was provided primarily by the National Institutes of Health. And then also just acknowledge I received author fees for 2 books, one that was published, Every Other Day Diet, about 10 years ago. And then I have a new one coming out this December called The Fastest Diet. And for any kind of research updates or practical tips, please follow me on Instagram at Dr. Krista Varady. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Varady, for an excellent presentation. Very interesting. So we can move into the Q&A now. A reminder to attendees, you can type questions into the Q&A box, or if you prefer, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom to ask any question. So our first question from Alice Lichtenstein says, have you or others looked at the effect of time-restricted eating within the context of a split period during the day? For example, 7 to 10 a.m. and 5 to 8 p.m.
7 to 10. No, actually, I have not seen. That might be reflected more in like the meal timing literature, but no, I haven't. That's a really interesting question, though.
Great. Anna Kurinska-Rudik says, thank you for a great talk. Are there any reports showing the microelements and vitamin absorptions during intermittent fasting, especially ADF?
Sorry.
I know you can read these too. There is a little bit more to this. It says, to briefly explain, is it an opinion that it's better to deliver some kind of biologic biological substance with limited absorption, for example, magnesium, several times a day. Therefore, I'm curious the shortening of the feeding window has any influence on microelement and vitamin levels.
So we've measured that just looking at like how much they're getting in their food records, but we haven't looked at it in blood yet. So just like indicators of status, other than like key ones like calcium and electrolytes. But we haven't looked at like, I don't think we've looked at magnesium, but in general, just reporting from their food records, you know, they're not restricting by that much. So they're still consuming like a fair amount of food. So we haven't seen them like dip below like RDAs for some of these things. But yeah, I think it definitely needs a lot more careful attention, and we need to start looking at like more of like status markers for that. But not many people have. So most of the time we're just looking at like food records. But yeah, it's a good area of future research for sure.
Shangdong Wang asks, human gut microbiota shows circadian rhythmicity in its composition. Could your 8-hour TRE study influence gut microbial composition alpha diversity?
Yeah, so we did measure that in our first study, the one from like 2017, the 8-hour window versus controls. And oddly, I don't know if we just weren't measuring it properly, but we didn't see any differences in like firmicutes or the bacteroides between groups. But I'm not at all a microbiome expert. You know, I ran this in conjunction with somebody that was, but my understanding is the microbiome even just changes like with every meal too. So we might not have, we tried to standardize it, but we might not have been measuring it properly. I'm currently running another year-long TRE study looking at colon cancer risk, like if it can change, if it can basically lower colon cancer risk in people that are at high risk of colon cancer. And I'm working with an expert in microbiome, and we're measuring that. So hopefully we'll have some better data in the next couple of years coming out.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Thank you. Haya Almi asks, have there been any trials examining the effects of time-restricted diet or intermittent fasting on inflammatory biomarkers or changes in gut microbiota?
They got definitely, we're just about to publish a review article on how intermittent fasting affects inflammation, and we just look at kind of like key circulating indicators like IL-6 and CRP and TNF alpha. And in general, the only thing that tends to be affected is CRP, like C-reactive protein, but not many changes in IL-6 and TNF alpha, even when people like lose a lot of weight and a lot of visceral fat mass, because visceral fat mass tends to produce more of those cytokines. But it's interesting because all over the internet and like everyone's like, oh, it's the best anti-inflammatory diet. But, you know, well, I guess there's everything all over the internet, but I'm just like, where are people getting this from? Because, you know, I'm just looking at the literature, that stuff very rarely changes. But I think maybe in animals, they're seeing kind of better changes. And I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in intermittent fasting animal literature that is just not being reproduced in humans, which is probably more like an adherence thing. You know, animals are like perfectly adherent because they have no choice, but humans don't really follow these diets as we want them to. So maybe that's why, you know, we're not seeing as great of changes. But again, yeah, so I think in animals, they're seeing a lot of positive changes with like inflammatory markers, but not so much in humans.
And how long were the study periods for the humans where you didn't see changes in inflammatory?
Between 2 to 12 months. And then the weight loss was usually between like 5 to 7%. So we looked at both like ADF and TRE.
Chao King Lai asks, does time-restricted eating affect cognitive function in the long term?
So that's another great question. That is something that I think is being explored right now by Mark Mattson's lab at the NIH. I think they've had a study in cognitive function, or it might be specifically like Alzheimer's and dementia, that type of thing. But I'm not at all a neuroscientist, so it's not really my area, but I haven't seen any data come out in humans just yet, just in animals, and it tends to be beneficial in animals. But I believe he's just wrapping up that study now. So hopefully we'll have some data soon.
Thank you. Robin Wilson says, thanks for the great talk. Is there any difference in male and female outcomes, especially on glucose or insulin homeostasis?
Yeah, another great question. So we've done kind of like a sub-analyses in all of our studies to see if there's differences. And then there was also a study published last year in New England Journal of Medicine by Liu et al. And they had like 150 people in that study, and it was pretty close to being half women, half men. So they did an analysis and found no differences for any marker. So body weight, visceral fat, all of that. So, but maybe, it could also be a question of being underpowered. We've also seen no changes, but most of our studies are about like 80% women, and they're smaller studies. So oftentimes we have like 10 men and we're comparing them to like 80 women or something. So it's difficult to get the appropriate amount of power to do like a sex-based difference analysis. But so far, even from other labs that have like larger sample sizes, we're not seeing any differences in insulin sensitivity or anything like that.
George Albug asks or says, thanks for a great presentation. Have you looked at the effects of these diets on bone metabolism?
Yeah, we have. We've looked at, well, we measure body composition usually by DEXA. So we're looking at like bone mineral content very regularly, and we have not seen those change at all for up to 12 months with about 5% weight loss or so. But I think my understanding, I'm also not like a bone expert, but I think with a bit more weight loss, we may see some changes there. I've seen that in the calorie restriction literature, but so far with kind of minimal weight loss, we haven't seen any changes.
Saidas says, excellent talk and elegant study designs. The time-restricted eating study, time-restricted eating windows study and the calorie-restricted versus time-restricted eating studies had excellent energy intake reductions. These are by self-reports, is that correct? Have these reductions in energy been objectively verified in any of your work?
So yeah, so we've mainly used like food records to measure this, which I realized, people, and we're always measuring people with obesity, and they tend to underreport energy intake, by 20 to 30%. So definitely something to keep in mind. We have used doubly labeled water in a year-long alternate day fasting study. And we did find kind of similar findings where the intermittent fasting group and the calorie restriction group were both reducing energy intake to a similar degree when we like objectively measured it. So, but it's true. We should try to use that. It's just so expensive. And yeah, it's hard to get, it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars when you're using doubly labeled water. So, but yeah, definitely important to do.
Okay. Larissa Constantinou asks, is there a benefit of the 6-hour eating window over the 8-hour window?
Good question. We've never, or I don't think anyone's directly compared the two. But just looking at the two studies side by side, there might be a bit more weight loss with a 6-hour window. But I think it'd be interesting to have a study where they were directly compared in like the same study. I think, in general, I think the shorter windows are producing more energy restriction and then more weight loss. One thing I always like to point out, I don't think there's anything magical about these diets. I think they work because people eat less and they're losing weight, and then they're losing visceral fat mass. So you're getting like the downstream effect of those changes. I don't think, I was going to mention this in my talk, I don't think ketones play a really big part in this type of intermittent fasting, just because, you don't really get into like full-blown ketosis for anywhere from like 3 to like 8 days. It varies a lot between individuals when they start making ketones and how much. So, ketones do have direct physiological benefits on like blood pressure and triglycerides and that type of thing. But I don't think any of it's really like mediated by ketones when you're only fasting for like 16 hours. I just don't think the ketones are high enough to do any of these changes. So sorry, just something I forgot to mention in the talk, but I usually get a question about that.
Hey, thank you. No, please, all the comments we're very interested in hearing. Okay, the next question is from Wen Zhang, who says, thank you so much for the great talk. My question is, when conducting months-long clinical trials on investigating the effect of time-restricted eating, what methods would you suggest for measuring adherence?
So we just use like REDCap, and we ask people to, there's just like a form in REDCap. We ask them to like log when they start and stop eating. You could also use, there's a lot of different apps right now, like Sachin Panda's group has one called My Circadian Clock, that one. And there's like Chronometer, which is, I think, just like freely available. So if you want to get at, like, we're just looking at start and ending time, and then we do like food records monthly to get at like what they're eating and when they're eating. But there are, I think Sachin Panda's one actually just looks at, like, it kind of has like a line for every day, and then you can like enter in when the meals are, or when the calorie consumption times are. So it really depends what you want to do. But in general, RedCap can do it pretty easily too, if you just want start and end times.
Okay, great. Chow Lai asks, do you see different responses to time restricted eating between young and older adults less than 75?
Yeah, so that's I was going to mention that when someone asked about the sex-based differences. The only difference we've really ever picked up on when we're doing like demographic like sub-analysis is older versus young participants. Older people, particularly postmenopausal women, tend to be way more adherent than younger people or premenopausal women. And we're not quite sure why this is. Maybe it's just because postmenopausal women may be less likely to have like younger kids at home and have, have childcare, that stuff. So they have more time to like focus on themselves and focus on the diet. But in general, yeah, older people are much more adherent. So then they tend to see like, if you stick to the diet more, then you're going to get better weight loss and better trajectories for all those outcomes. But yeah, older people tend to do better on them. All the different types of intermittent fasting too, alternate day fasting, 5-2, and TRE. And it's over 50 is what we used as a cutoff for like older.
Okay. Great. Thank you everyone for all of these questions. This has been great discussion. We have another question. And we are going to stop a little before the hour. So if you have a question, please get it in now. I think I saw a raised hand come up, but it went down. So Alan Taylor says, very interesting and useful talk. Thanks. You showed insulin data after time-restricted eating. Did you see any change in HbA1c after TRE?
So we haven't seen any. We do measure A1C as well. We have not seen any changes, but our people are generally they don't have pre-diabetes and they don't have diabetes. So again, our A1Cs are usually around 5.5 or so to start. However, we are just finishing up a study, like literally like in the next couple of weeks, in people with type 2 diabetes. So we're comparing TRE to CR to controls. Hopefully that'll be published like in the summer, but we are seeing a change there. So A1C is going down to a similar extent as in CR by about 0.5. And that's significant versus controls. So the only time we've seen changes is in people with type 2 diabetes.
I think we have time for one or maybe two more questions. Narupa Matin says, you showed that diet quality did not differ between participants who followed TRE versus control. However, have you performed subgroup analysis comparing cardiometabolic risk profiles of participants who followed a healthy diet pattern during their TRE feeding window versus those that may be eating a less healthy pattern?
Oh, interesting. No, we haven't, but yeah, I see. So people that have like higher risk profile at baseline, to like tease those people out and do like, yeah, that would be it. That's a great idea, actually. I don't know if that person wants to email me, we can have something to collaborate on if you want.
Okay, Narupa, very interesting idea. Let's collaborate. Okay, we have one more question. This will be the last question for today. Dawn Harrison asks, do you know if your participants exercised? And if so, did those that exercise lose even more weight than just those who adhere to the TRE?
So sorry, I forgot to mention this, but we always exclude people that are like athletes just because, that would confound the data. And then our individual, we have them wear like Fitbits throughout the trial, and we measure steps per day. Just to make sure we just don't want the exercise to confound the weight loss effects of the diet. So we ask them to just not change any of their behaviors And we usually kind of exclude people that are participating in like exercise classes at the beginning. So most of the time we see steps per day stays the same. It's usually between 6,000 to 7,000 per day on average in each of our groups. But so yeah, hopefully that's not confounding it. Hopefully they're reporting what they're doing, but who knows?
All right. So that will be the last question, and that concludes today's seminar. Thank you so much to our speaker, and thank you to the audience for attending. Hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Okay, thank you.